So on to today. We're pleased to welcome Alice Wilson, who's a PhD student at the University of York. Alice's work focuses on unconventional solutions to the housing crisis, specifically self-build tiny houses, which is what she'll be speaking to us about today. So we're pleased to welcome Alice, and I shall hand over to her now. Thank you, Alice.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for that introduction, Alice. Just let me share my screen. Lovely stuff. Yep, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I've been looking forward to this since we agreed that it was going to be happening a few months ago now. And I'd just like to thank Dr. Alice Butler-Walk again for organising the series. It takes a lot of work behind the scenes to find the speakers and create the schedule and everything like that. And we all benefit from it. So thanks very much for that. What I'm going to be speaking to you about today is really about freedom. Freedom to be able to make certain choices, freedom from having to do certain other things, and how we can look at this through the lens of tiny houses. And what I'm going to suggest is that tiny houses are a way of creating a world within the broader landscape of the world that we live in order to access this life of greater freedom than the inhabitants might otherwise be able to experience. So as Alice said, I'm a second year PhD researcher at the University of York. I belong to the sociology department. As a sociologist, what I'm really interested in is stories. I'm interested in what people do and why they do it and what's the significance of that and what does it all mean. So in that vein, I would like to give you some context and explain to you the development of my own interest in tiny houses by sort of setting the scene of my own story. So this is me, circa 18 months old. That's my dad in the background there with his fake Bill Gates look, which he clings on to this very day. My mother assures me that I have subsequently grown into my ears. I will reserve judgment. And here are my brother and sister. That's my brother on the far right-hand side, Corin, and my sister, Maisie, in the middle. And the reason that these people are here in the talk is because I think when you find any researcher or really any professional in any industry who cares very deeply about something and wants the world to change in a particular way, they're thinking about someone when they want those changes to happen, right? Most researchers, most change makers have had an experience or hold someone dear to their hearts who they want the world to be different for. I'm sure that everybody watching can conjure an image of somebody who they'd like the world to be a better place for. And for me, it's my brother and sister. So like 42% of the population in the UK, we grew up in a predominantly a single parent household. So my parents separated when I was 9, my brother was 5 years old, and my sister was just 1 year old. And what this meant was that when our dad left, a huge portion of our household income also left, which meant that we were one of the 14 million people who live below the poverty line. So the poverty line is calculated by assessing the median income of the country and taking 60% of that. And if a household lives on less than 60% of that amount, they're deemed to be living in poverty. So this year, the median income in the UK is just over £30,000. So if you're living on roughly £18,000 or less, you're below the poverty line. Poverty obviously is a word with a lot of presumptions and stigmas and misunderstanding surrounding it. So what did that actually mean for these three little whippersnappers here that you can see in terms of our lived experiences? What were our lives actually like? The enduring memory that the three of us share is just how cold it was inside the house. Routinely over the winter months, there was ice on the inside of the windows and you could see your breath inside. 1 year, our central heating broke, so we had no heating or hot water. And we had a large copper vat, it must have been a 100-litre copper vat that we would plug into the socket. We would fill that with water and leave it for a few hours in order to heat enough water to make a little shallow bath that I got first dibs on as the eldest. My younger brother and sister weren't so lucky. And honestly, we really didn't realize how strange that was. And it's really only been in the last few years, once you've had that distance from your childhood experiences, that you can reflect on what you have experienced and realize that it's not that normal, really, not that usual. What else did it mean to grow up living below the poverty line? It meant that small things like new school uniforms weren't always affordable to us. So if we went to a school where they would change from having a polo shirt uniform to a blazer, and that you also needed a tie as well and some different regulation shoes or something like that, we couldn't always afford it. Something that poverty does is visibly mark you out as being separate from the group. And a lot of, memories that still evoke intense shame and embarrassment related to those visual markers of being poor and what that meant. But really, probably the most significant thing is just the general feeling of stress and anxiety and fear that came with being poor. And this was always in the context of the mortgage. How are we going to pay the mortgage? Are we going to be able to pay the mortgage this year? My mum was working roughly 12-hour days to pay the mortgage. Food, you can learn to bulk buy and grow some things and, take on economic recipes that feed you for weeks on beans. Ditto clothes, you can make your own clothes, you can buy from charity shops. Heating, electricity, water, you can use less of it in order to have a lower bill. But rental and mortgage payments are the one brutalizingly unchangeable expense that lands every month, which you can't do anything to reduce. So I started to look into this a little bit more and discovered that across England, rental properties take up 43% of women's median earnings and 28% of men's median earnings. So that's quite a big difference. I'm sure all of you can imagine having 43% of your income take away every month or 28%, and which one you prefer. It's an easy choice to make. But it's also significant because the agreed upon definition of affordable housing is if your housing takes up a third or less of your income, then you're deemed to be in affordable housing. So another way to interpret this data is adding a little more detail. Every area of England has affordable housing to offer to men, except London, which is bad news for everyone. But there isn't a single area of England that can offer affordable housing to women on their median earnings. There is nowhere that a woman can live where accommodation on average will cost her a third or less of her income. And when you move from the rental sector into the purchasing sector, it's not a more cheering landscape, I'm unhappy to report. So women need on average 12 times their annual salary to be able to buy a home in England, while men need on average 8 times their salary. Again, this is pretty bad news for everyone when you consider that high street banks, mortgage lenders, will tend to offer an individual 3 times their salary as a mortgage loan. So men will struggle to get a mortgage on their own, so will women. In order to circumnavigate this problem, what we often find is that people team up to buy houses, right? But the teams they most often make are romantic pair-bonded teams, heterosexually pair-bonded teams, which means that lots of people are in relationships which they don't want to be in, but they have to stay in because they can't afford to live on their own. The affordable housing crisis is both chronic and acute. I have data here from England and Wales, where you can very clearly see 1997, the average price of a house in relation to the income of the mortgage applicant, 3.5 times somebody's annual income. Still a lot of money. And the latest year that this data was available for, 2016, saw house prices in England increase to almost 8 times a person's salary. The increase has been similar in Wales, just not as aggressive. Because of this, and what we briefly mentioned before about many women feeling the need to stay in a relationship as a way of keeping a roof over their heads, is linked to the fact that women are more likely to endure violent and sexual crimes in their home than anywhere else. 2 women per week in England and Wales are killed in domestic violence settings. And we know that being unable to leave a relationship has financial components. The majority of statutory homeless people are women. In 2019, this was 67% of statutory homeless people. And a huge proportion of those homeless women are single mothers who are homeless with their children, who have often fled exactly the type of frightening and dangerous domestic situation that we have just discussed. So even when we're not considering life and death situations, I would like to present this data in order to continue to problematize the romantic notion of home as somewhere to safely retreat to relax and be protected. Because gender exists, it's a component of how all types of social relations take place. And this includes the home. So here we can see data which shows participation in time spent per day in unpaid domestic labor and family and caring responsibilities. So you can see over here in Turkey, the blue line represents the female hours per day spent, and the yellow line represents the average male hours per day spent. And then the orange diamonds across the top here is the national average. So in Turkey, women are spending 5 hours per day on average on housework, whilst men are spending 1.5 hours. Norway, predictably, doing a fair bit better, where women are spending about 3.5 hours a day and men are just behind them there. It's just shy of 3 hours. And if we scoot across to the left here, we can see data for the United Kingdom, which shows that women on average are spending just shy of 4 hours per day on unpaid domestic labor, and men tend to spend around 2.5 hours per day. We also know that where you live is a vector for what kind of life you can expect to have. So the Marmot Review is quite an infamous by now report, which assessed life outcomes based on postcodes. This was carried out in 2010 and has just recently been re-evaluated in 2020 to gauge the progress over the last decade. The Marmot Review revealed essentially that the postcode in which you're born has one of the strongest predicting factors for your quality of life, your educational attainment, how long you're likely to live, and how many of those years are likely to be disease and disability free. It probably won't surprise many people to learn that over the last 10 years of Conservative government, the income inequality and the associated health gap has widened. And the life expectancy improvements that we've been enjoying in England since the 1800s have stalled and have actually declined for the poorest 10% of women. This is data from Scotland, which relates to how much social housing and state-sponsored housing has been built and how much private sector housing has been built. And what it clearly indicates is a huge drop-off of public sector and housing association houses, which you can see in the darker blue. And the paler blue, the private sector, is where they've been picking up the slack ever since then. Another way to express this information is in the context of not only are we not building as many socially affordable houses as we were, we also continue to build unaffordable houses. What this means is that there are hundreds of thousands of vacant houses in England, Scotland, and Wales that could have people living in them, only it's not deemed to be profitable enough to put them in there. So this might at first seem a dreary tale that we have in excess of 200,000 homes empty in England, 34,000 in Scotland, and just shy of 27,000 in Wales. But I try to interpret this in an encouraging light. So what this says to me is that people who are precariously housed, people who are homeless, and people living in poverty are living this life because of choices that are made, policies that are passed. And that means that different choices can be made and different policies can be passed. So it seems fairly obvious to me that we can change these numbers and change the lived reality of the people that these numbers represent. One component of this that I'm interested in is the extent to which a very small number of very large and powerful house builders have monopolized the market. So perhaps free market capitalism wouldn't be such a bad way of distributing resources and opportunities, but that's not what we have. One of the defining qualities of free market capitalism is choice in the market, competition, and the tessellating powers of supply and demand. What we can see in the housing industry is that it's become increasingly a market that's driven by supply and not by demand, which is why we have so many expensive empty houses and such a lack of affordable houses that people so desperately need. This is represented well by the statistics that in 1988, there were 12,000 small to medium enterprise house builders. So small to medium enterprise means fewer than 250 employees and a smaller turnover than 50 million. It's still quite big, it's still quite a lot of money, but not in comparison with the many billions that, for example, Wimpy Taylor or Persimmon Homes, something like that would make. By 2017, the 12,000 small to medium enterprise builders had reduced to just 2,500. So that percentage of the market share that they had, that 40% of the new housing stock that they were building, has been taken over by a decreasing number of oligarchic transnational corporations. In 2017, small to medium enterprise builders accounted for only 12% of the new housing stock. Access to land is another component in the justice or lack thereof regarding the housing crisis. So a 2016 analysis showed that 69% of Britain's land is owned by just 0.6% of the population. This is obviously a problem and is implicated in artificially increasing the price of land and property when many hundreds of thousands of hectares are held in investment portfolios, which we refer to as land banking, and they're speculatively held as an investment in the same way that stocks and shares would be held, waiting to be able to sell it at the time of the investors choosing to turn a profit. When considering the question of freedom and how tiny houses might augment somebody's experience of freedom, it's relevant to consider our working practices, right? So full-time employees in Britain worked an average of 42 hours a week in 2018. This is significant because it's 2 hours longer than the average working hours in Europe. And what that means is that in a given year, you and I are working on average 3 weeks longer per year than our European counterparts. To compound this problem, a 2018 survey by YouGov found that 40% of Brits report that they find their jobs to be meaningless, which means that a huge amount of us are spending a lot of hours doing something that we don't believe in the value of. The implications here for self-esteem, mental health, and well-being are profound. On top of that, we are working these long hours in jobs that have a spurious level of fulfillment for less wages than we ever have been before. Britain is currently enduring the longest period of wage stagnation since the Napoleonic Wars 200 years ago. In real terms, this means that our earnings have decreased by 3% in the last 10 years. And also the distribution of workers has been augmented significantly in the last 10 years. There's been a sharp rise in 0 hours contracts, which might be all right for some people. It might offer them the flexibility that they need. However, the Trades Union Congress, in a survey conducted in 2017, found that 66% of people on 0 hours contracts would prefer to be on a guaranteed hours contracts. So they're not serving the people who are working in this way. It's for the benefit of corporations, not for the benefit of individuals. In summary, pretty much no matter who you are, it's a bit of a bad situation, really. If you're a female, it's a double thumbs down. So the question that this really brings us to in this talk, and the question that I focus predominantly on in my own research, is how can we step away from a system that we depend on, where we identify that a system is unfit for purpose or is actively harmful? How can we extricate ourselves from that when we depend on it for our survival? And this main question can be broken down into three constituent parts. The first one is, how can we step away from the live to work mentality? So this is referring back to the data that we covered about how long we work in jobs that we don't really like for less money than we used to. Related, the second part of the question is, how can we step away from the work to spend mentality? Ubiquitous advertising and compulsory consumption are such an integral part of our culture that we barely even notice that we're being subject to this all the time. Inbuilt obsolescence of technology being programmed to shut itself down after a certain number of years when the new release of the technology is due to be relinquished into the market. All these kinds of things people are identifying that they're not happy with, but are looking for ways to move away from this way of living. And the third component of the question is closely linked to this, which is how can we step away from the eco side, which is implicit in compulsory and overconsumption, and is built in to an economic system which demands growth at all costs. So this is where tiny houses come in. So we have lots of different examples of tiny houses. We have models that are built to be road towable on trailer bases. We have converted vans, we have shipping containers, and here, this is me being unspeakably brave on the fourth rung of the ladder, weatherproofing the front panel of our log cabin. And that's a wide angle lens, which makes it look considerably grander than it is. It's a shed. So what do tiny houses offer that conventional homes do not? Well, the first and probably the most salient factor is how affordable they are in comparison with traditional homes. So the average construction price of a tiny house is in the region of £30,000. When people ask how much does a tiny house cost, this is very much akin to asking how long is a piece of string. I have participants in my own research who have spent £80,000 on their tiny house. I also have a participant who spent £900 on his tiny house. But an approximate figure for roughly in the middle is about £30,000. When you consider this in comparison with the average house price on the purchasing market in the UK of £239,000, you can see how much of a profound difference that is. So a tiny house will cost in the region of 12% of what a traditional home would cost. So if you imagine that you are beginning your homeowner journey and you're starting to save up to make this dream come true, by saving the amount that you would need roughly for a deposit for your traditionally purchased home, you could outright own a home that you've designed and built yourself with no rental or mortgage payments for the foreseeable future. And I'm sure all of us could spend a happy half an hour or two imagining what our lives would be like with no rental or mortgage payments. Tiny houses are affordable to construct because they're small, but they also remain affordable in perpetuity because the amount of money, the biggest amount of money that we spend in our homes and the biggest amount of energy that we use in our homes is on heating and cooling the internal space. So with a smaller cubic space inside to heat and cool, significantly lower bills and a significantly lower carbon burden in the generation of this energy. Something else that comes up a lot, which kind of surprised me actually when I began this research, is how much praise is available from tiny house inhabitants about how much less maintenance a tiny house takes. Imagine how long it would take to hoover that house compared to wherever you're living now. People report how much more free time they have as a result of how much less stuff there is to clean and maintain and organize and tidy. Another huge pull factor into the tiny house movement is that you get to design and build a home completely bespoke to your individual needs. And I suspect that most people in their lifetimes have had the thought, wouldn't it be cool to build your own home and have everything exactly where you want it, exactly to meet your needs? If you're looking at taking a conventional route to self-build, an indicative price in the UK market to build a 2-bed home is £280,000. That it's incomparable to the construction cost of a tiny house. Tiny houses are often mobile and always non-permanent. So what this means is that in a conventionally built property, you have a field where the developer is going to come in, and then they have heavy plant hire on the location where they dig up the earth, they run in gas, electricity, water, supply lines, they bury concrete and steel girder foundations and build the house upwards from there. Tiny houses don't have that, which has a number of potential benefits. The first one is how quickly they can be built, how non-invasively they can be built, and the significant reduction in pollution, transportation of materials, from not having to dig in and build concrete bases and to bring mains, gas, electricity and water, those kinds of things. A lot of tiny houses are made of timber, and if not timber, then recycled and reclaimed materials, as well as some quite exciting green tech innovations like hempcrete or mycelium blocks, which is essentially mushrooms made into bricks. As a result of building a construction from timber rather than concrete and steel, you can decrease the carbon burden of that construction by as much as 96% when the timber is sourced from sustainably managed forests. That is a profound reduction in the pollution associated with a construction. And this isn't a very high-tech solution. Just using timber is what a lot of Scandinavian countries have been doing for centuries, and will be a relatively easy, simple alternative to what we're currently doing. So freedom to do certain things and freedom from having to do certain other things are tessellated into the world of tiny houses. And people who are building them often frame them in this way of building a world within a world. And inside their tiny world, they can experience freedoms in the context of the broader world, which they experience as constraining or oppressive. So the kinds of freedoms that have come up in interviews over the last 2 years with more than 30 participants is freedom from debt. Once you take on a mortgage, you nominally own your home, but you are of course obliged to maintain a salary that will enable you to meet your monthly mortgage repayments. Freedom to choose your profession. Lots of my participants talk about how they were able to work part-time after living in a tiny house, or move into a different industry, which is less well remunerated, but significantly more fulfilling. Freedom to work fewer hours. Freedom from shared housing. This was an interesting one, because when you think about say a group of students or recent graduates, young adults living in a shared house where there's say 5 of them, it might be the case that the bedroom that the one person has in their shared house might not be much different in size from a tiny house. But the thing that they talk about a lot is you can't cook when you want to, you can't use the bathroom when you want to, you can't roam around and invite your friends over. And it's not about the absolute square footage of the size. It's about how fit for purpose is that space in which you live. And how do you feel when you're in it? Do you feel encroached upon? Do you feel nervous? Do you feel like you can't go and sit in the living room? Or do you feel like able to use all of the space for everything that you need to do in a typical day? Freedom from compulsory consumption. You can't buy 200 pairs of trainers if you have nowhere to put them. There's an interesting bisection in the people who come to tiny houses. On one side, people who are deliberately looking for ways to reduce their consumption, reduce their carbon burden, and they see tiny houses as a way to achieve this, and that's why they come to the movement. Other people come to it for a range of different reasons and find out as a result of living in a tiny house that they're sort of forced in a way to move away from compulsory consumption and report feeling better off for that. Freedom to move geographically. I have a few cases of participants who have been very grateful for living in a mobile tiny house because it means they've been able to, at short notice, go and live with parents who are aging, with relatives or friends who need support and help in whatever's happening in their lives at that moment in time. And this geographical flexibility also lends itself to being able to take on jobs and freelancing work and things like that that they might not so easily be able to do otherwise. Freedom to design, build, and upskill. This is a really interesting one for me, especially in the case of women, where the construction industry isn't typically gendered as a feminine workspace, and women are often made to feel that they can't or shouldn't use power tools and draw up architectural designs and build their own things. And freedom to retrain and start businesses. This is really common in the tiny house population, that once they've liberated that time or financial resource, they go back to school, they take continuing professional development qualifications, they start their own businesses. So I'll have a look at some of the things that my participants have actually said so that you can get a flavour for what kind of experiences they're having. So Martin very smugly proclaimed, "I don't have a mortgage, so I don't really need to work." I think if there's one take-home summary from what this is really all about, that's it, isn't it? I don't have a mortgage, so I don't really need to work. And this quote goes on at length to all of the fun things he does with his time now as a result of not having to work to pay a mortgage. He took up welding, he learned to fix boats, he keeps chickens. Victoria said, "I want to build something beautiful that is sustainable, where you can have autonomy and be independent." And this is something that's really been a defining finding over the last 2 years, is this notion of autonomy and independence under a system of constraint. Will said that with more disposable income, there are lots of other choices you can make that don't revolve around being in debt to someone. So this could be in the context of not being in debt to a bank, not being in debt to a landlord, and not being held captive by an employer who dictates, not so much now, but where you physically are and how you spend your time. In the area of compulsory consumption, Charlotte said, "We had so much stuff, so much junk, and it was really stressing me out." And John echoed this sentiment by saying, "The amount of clothes and crap that everyone has that you really don't need." This came up again and again, that people found their stuff, their possessions were actually a source of stress, not a source of pleasure, and that they were grateful for what they described as the simplification of their material lives, their material surroundings, and how that translated into a psychological experience of a simplified life and the benefits that flowed from that. Moving on to thinking about self-build, Bethany said, "I love it because I've made it with my own 2 hands." There was something really, really powerful about being there to witness these people talking about this in person, get all glassy-eyed, you know, and they're like stroking the wall that they put up and telling you lovingly about where they got all their floorboards from and how pesky that nail was to hammer in. It's a completely different way of relating to your physical surroundings, and it seemed to give them a lot of pleasure. Victoria said, "It's not just a roof over someone's head, it's about the quality of that space and a home that works on so many different levels." So this we can relate back to when we discussed about the difference between living in a shared house in 20 meters squared and living in a tiny house that's 20 meters squared. So it's not just about the size, and it's not just about a survival of having a roof over your head. It's about how do you feel in that space and what does it mean for the quality of the rest of your life. So regarding the supply and demand of the market and the failings of neoliberalism, Helen observed, "Innovation is touted at every corner in both the academic and commercial world, but for some reason this has not translated into housing, where a small number of companies have monopolized the construction industry and all houses look more or less the same." So this links a little bit, again, back to the self-build aspect of it, where not only are you diversifying who can create products in the housing market by opening up the self-build arena, but there's also a real appreciation of the aesthetic of homes, you know. A lot of people who I've spoken to have expressed kind of disdain or boredom that most of our houses are clones of each other. If you live in a flat, it looks like that. If you live in a semi-detached, it looks like that. And there's no variety. And they're really celebrating the unique and individual appearance of tiny houses that are built by unique individuals. Anne says, There's no choice in the market now with new houses. It's what builders can make the most profit out of. And we can clearly see from the statistics that we've already examined that this is the case. Will has said tiny houses, especially in people's back gardens, can help to dilute the effects of gentrification. This is a really interesting idea and one that's gaining traction in the USA and Australia. So what often happens is a situation like this. You grow up in your parents' home, and when you leave home, you decide to have a family of your own and you want to stay close to your parents, but you can't afford to live in that neighborhood anymore. When they moved there 50 years ago, they paid 75p for their lovely terraced house that you grew up in, and now it's worth £250,000 and you can't afford to live there. So by building a tiny house in the back garden, we can keep those vital social networks of people together, connected, and preclude or at least interrupt the formation of ghettos of the super rich and the super poor. One way that this is being addressed, mostly in the US, is rent the backyard schemes, where companies exist who do exactly this. So they go to expensive neighborhoods and they build and pay for a tiny house to be constructed in a back garden. And then the owner of the house and the garden takes a cut of the rental income from this tiny house, which of course is essentially a peppercorn amount of rent, which is why it meets multiple needs. So it uses land which might otherwise not be developable. So this addresses some of the impact of urban sprawl and keeps development of new housing within the central urban matrix, which is great for reducing commuting times, reducing pollution, keeping people close to their jobs, and also interrupts this formation of ghettos. Bethany and John really summarized this pretty well, along the same lines as Martin, who said, I don't have a mortgage, so I don't need a job. Bethany said, 50 grand for a beautiful house rather than 150 grand for a shitty flat is kind of nice. She was living in Edinburgh, which is one of the more expensive places that you can live in Scotland. And John said, why take on a 30-year mortgage to buy a dream house and then pay for it 45 hours a week until you're dead? And this is something that came up a lot in the interviews. People were sort of scratching their heads and saying, hang on a minute, I work 45 hours a week to pay for a home that I'm never in, that I don't get to enjoy because I'm always at work. Of course, this situation has been complicated by the global lockdowns, and different questions are being raised about the home and how it works and if it can work as an employment space as well. But at the time when he said this, it's a very common sentiment that was being expressed by my participants. So if we start to think about some kind of conclusions of what do we want to take away from this really. First of all, I'll say that it's a minority of people who want tiny houses. This is not a solution for everyone. It's not even a solution for most people. But with a problem as pernicious and complicated as the housing crisis, we are going to need many different forms of solution. This could be one of them, particularly for young people, for single women, single mothers, and another huge demographic in the tiny house population are older divorced women who haven't been able to save up enough money to buy a traditional home because they've spent a majority of their lives outside of the labour force doing unpaid work in the home, raising children. Then the divorce comes and they're stuck. We've seen that it's not just about small spaces. What really seems to be happening, I think, is that people are looking for ways to achieve financial freedom in a system which it's very difficult to gain financial freedom in unless you are already born with it. What always seems to be linked to conversations around tiny housing is questioning dominant employment and consumer practices, and these go hand in hand, of course, alongside a desire for a lower carbon footprint and ways that this can be achieved. Tiny houses present a sort of synergistic melting pot where all of these different atomized notions about how to live a good life and how to live a free life meet together in a way that is practical and achievable. Having said that, of course, there are many barriers to living in a tiny house. So when we think back to the main question that we were considering at the beginning, which is how to extricate yourself from a system that you depend on, and the three constituent parts of that question, what we're beginning to see is that tiny houses might be able to offer some people a way to step away from a live to work culture, a way to step away from work to spend mentality, and a way to extricate themselves from the planetary destruction that's associated with those practices. There are a lot of people doing a lot of good work in this arena already. So the New Zealand Tiny House Association is the first national association in the world to draft new legislature, which offers ways for planning permission and building regulations to understand what tiny houses are and to grant them legal status as primary residential dwellings. A little bit closer to home, we have the tiny house community in Bristol. They're a community interest company who have just received planning permission for their development of tiny eco homes in Uphouse, which is based in York, where I'm speaking to you from now. And this is a company that I'm working with. We're working very closely with City of York Council and Homes England to bring the first self-built tiny house plots to the city. And then a little closer to where some of you perhaps are is Social Bite in Edinburgh. If you don't know about this organisation, I really suggest that you go and check them out. They're doing fantastic work. As the name suggests, it's a lot to do with giving people food and drinks. But what they've also done is create a fantastic tiny house village that's supported housing to help people transition from homelessness to going back into the community. They're doing really amazing work there, and they've made some really beautiful tiny houses. One of our partners who we work with when I'm wearing my Ophouse hat is a company called Minitopia, and they're working out of Den Bosch in the Netherlands. They are doing fantastic work over there. They have at least 15 self-built tiny house plots now that have been running successfully for 2 years, a real variety in that neighborhood. So there's a student fresh out of university who built his tiny house for 5,000 euros. And then we have some retired architects who've built this amazing spaceship looking very modern thing for about 50,000 euros, and everything in between. They've done a fantastic job of making sure the neighborhood is diverse and inclusive. They also have a fantastic arrangement with the local council in that a percentage of the tiny house self-built plots are apportioned to a housing association for use as social housing. And they weren't sure how this was going to go. No one had done it before. The scheme eventually went live, and the Minitopia social housing tiny house received the most applications for people wanting to live there than any social house that they've ever had on the register before. So there's real empirical evidence that people want this, that it can be done, and that they enjoy it once they're there, and there's a cascade of benefits that flow from living in this way. So I'd like to conclude by leaving you with this quote from Schaefer. He's a tiny house builder. He's been building tiny houses for almost 40 years now. What he says is, "Too many of our houses are not a refuge from chaos, but merely extensions of it." I'd be really interested to know who among you can relate to this sentiment and what you think about tiny houses as a potential way to speak to this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. That was really interesting. And I was furiously taking notes. So I think, why don't we open this up to questions? If you have a question that you'd like to be put to Alice, please can you pop it in the chat box, and I can put that forward to Alice. Maybe we could start with something while people are typing. I had a question about something that you alluded to a couple of times about what are the demographics of people involved in or part of the tiny house population. And I realize that might be predominantly UK-based population that you're looking at, or more globally. Yeah,
it's a great question, one that I'm really interested in myself as well. So one of the things that we're realizing when we look into this is that the data doesn't really exist. So if you do like a Google terms search, you'll start to see the word tiny house picking up traction and gaining, you know, like popular parlance around 2005 or 6, somewhere around that. And then really started to take off after 2014. So in the scheme of like sociological phenomena, it's quite recent. So there hasn't yet been much large-scale examination of who is involved in this movement and what their demographic qualities are. It's something that I'm really, really keen to do, but I also have to be realistic. I'm greedy by inclination, and I want to do all of the things and know all of the stuff. But I also hope to actually achieve my doctorate in the time that I have left. So I'm looking for partners to do that work with. The short answer is it's a little bit of everyone. Something that we've been quite happy to discover in our work with Ophouse is that people who could afford to live in a conventional home are also not interested in doing that. There's something else that tiny houses offer aside from how affordable they are.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got questions coming in fairly thick and fast. So we shall just start and go in order. How did your participants find land for their tiny houses?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's probably the number one issue. Maybe it's not helpful to try and hierarchicalize them actually, because all of the issues tessellate with each other. So how do they find land? Unfortunately, most of the way that they find land means that tiny houses are still only available to people who already have the social and cultural capital to look after themselves anyway, right? So how do they find land? They know someone who's got a massive garden or a farm where they can put their tiny house without it gaining planning permission as a primary residential dwelling, which is very difficult to do, and no one's going to know about it, essentially. So this is also implicated with extending financial products out for people who want to build tiny houses. So of course you can't get a mortgage style loan for a tiny house because the asset against which a mortgage loan is secured is the land that the property is built on, which tiny houses definitionally don't come with. So planning permission, building regulations, and financial like loan providers don't really understand what tiny houses are, and they don't feel like a safe bet. And then the only other option available to people who can't save up or don't have the money is to take a personal loan in the same way that you might take one to pay for a car, a wedding, a holiday. There are two big problems with that. Item number one, a lot of people who want to live in a tiny house for economic reasons don't have the kind of credit rating that would allow them to take a £30,000 loan. Item number two, if you look at the standard interest rates on mortgage loans at the moment, they're like 1%, something less than that. But generally we can say maybe like 2 or 3% on a mortgage loan. For personal loans that you would take to pay for whatever you want to buy, it's astronomically more expensive. So there's not a good solution to this yet, I think, because of how new it is. But I'm heartened by the progress that people are making in other areas of like making tiny houses communities happen. So I think that there is certainly ways for us to address these issues.
Brilliant. And we've got a question that feeds on quite nicely from that. So maybe we'll take that actually. Do you get the question in your research that some people even would find £30,000 a big step to take? What interim steps can you recommend to people in your research? Some people may pay so much rent that they can't save up. Should one build a tiny, tiny, tiny house as a start?
This is a fantastic question. And it's a problem that we bump up against all the time. You're so right to point it out. Of course, in comparison with £250,000, 30 grand, very cheap. But in absolute terms, I don't have 30 grand. Most people don't have 30 grand. If we did, this problem would kind of have solved itself, right? So again, this links back to what we said before about how there needs to be a better policy and legislature understanding, as well as a better cultural understanding of what tiny houses are, in order to reassure lenders that this is something that they can extend appropriate financial products to. In terms of what have my participants done to raise this kind of money, all sorts of stuff. So saving up as and when they can, again, doing things in pairs and partners, friends, brothers and sisters, couples, saving up the money, borrowing it from friends and family, again, that's a problem, because socioeconomic status kind of like puts you into social groups, which means that poor people don't have friends and relatives that they can borrow money off of. That's, you know, that's the point. It's reinforcing that trap. In short, you still need a certain amount of privilege to be able to access this form of living. The best way for people who are really struggling, I'm not sure if I want to recommend anything, but what we're trying to do with Ophouse, for example, is, as a social enterprise, access grant money and support from the council and the housing association so that we pay for and build those homes, and that they can then be rented out. So imagine if you're paying like £200 a month rent in comparison with whatever you're paying now, then you might be in a position where you could save up money to take the next steps on the housing ladder, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And this is all very nice that everything seems to connect here. But you mentioned perhaps pairing up with somebody to go into the tiny house movement. One of the questions we have here is, what about size? Is a tiny house for a sole resident?
No, not at all. That will come down to your individual proclivity for how much space you need to feel good and to feel okay. I would say most of my participants are either single or in couples, but I also have participants who are families with children. I think the most people I know of that live in a tiny house is a couple and 2 children and a dog and some cats. So it's a cost benefit analysis that different people will arrive at different conclusions with, right? So to some people that will be intolerable, but perhaps what they're doing there is thinking, well, maybe it is a bit uncomfortable, but it's less uncomfortable than whatever our living situation was in before.
Brilliant. We had another question actually about whether children could live in tiny houses, but I think you've answered that. We have a question here, fascinating and inspiring, a couple of really basic questions. Would a self-contained bedsit in an existing building and or a multi-home building count as a tiny house?
Mm-hmm. This is a great question, and I have had to make some, like, draw a line in the sand essentially as to who I can include in my research and who I can't. Of course, different people will include different types of dwellings in their definition of what a tiny house is. I wouldn't include that as a tiny house, I think, because of all of the other components that are associated with the tiny house movement, as we discussed, you know, like a deliberate desire to move away from normative working and consuming practices, and a specific desire to reduce carbon burden, which I suppose you could also achieve in a bedsit, but you could also achieve it in a 3-bed terrace or in a townhouse, you know. I think some aspect of being involved in the design and build of the property seems to be quite salient in the community, and perhaps that's what really differentiates a small bedsit from a tiny house.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've got a couple of questions. I might actually just lump them together about more of the kind of practicalities. So we've got, how do utilities work? So water supply, gas, electricity, is it solar and plumbing and sewage? And related to that, and touching on this idea about land and being able to get the land to build something on, you speak about freedom to build. Are there no building regulations regarding tiny houses?
Great questions, all great questions. Utilities. One of the major benefits in terms of carbon burden and the environmental impact of tiny houses is that because they don't have permanent foundations and they don't have the utilities dug in like a conventional house does, that they predominantly rely on green and renewable sources of energy. As the person has suggested, this often includes solar panels, wind turbines, biomass heaters, some pretty daring like setups where you can harvest the product of your composting toilet and like cook it up somewhere over there, and then in a few weeks you can use it in your fire to keep warm. It's very, some people are really like self-contained in a very impressive way, But yes, that's how utilities work. They can also work in the US. I think this happens quite a lot, where tiny house communities exist in sort of like trailer park environments. So they'll have like a mains electricity hookup grid, which they go like a caravan would do, and then hook up to the like electricity or gas supply or whatever of wherever they're staying, or you can bring gas canisters in. But predominantly they do use renewable energy, as you've suggested, yes. And then in terms of building regulations for tiny houses, a fantastic and very relevant question. So annoyingly, I'm going to say the most sociologist thing ever, which is it depends. So, so to use the example of our own tiny house. So we are very lucky that we bought our house 2 years ago together, me and my fiance and my sister. So we own the land, we own the garden, privilege for us. We had to get planning permission for the tiny house on the grounds that it was at its tallest height, 3 meters or higher, and at the same time is within 2.5 meters of the boundary to the neighboring property. So if you tick those 2 boxes, you have to get planning permission, even if you're just building a shed, which we have just built a shed, because there's no way that we could get legal permission to have it as a residentially certified dwelling. So we have to get planning permission for our tiny house. We can't legally use it to live in. It has to be an ancillary to the property use. So like a home gym or a home office or a she shed or a den or whatever. Because so few tiny houses are granted primary residential status, there isn't really building regulations associated with that, because you don't need so many building regulations for a space that people aren't going to live in. It's something that we're looking at in detail with Ophouse, working in connection with the New Zealand Tiny House Association, because they've done such a fantastic job of creating from scratch exactly what you're suggesting we need, which we do, which is full building regulations that take into account what tiny houses need to be safe. And something that often crops up as a problem is minimum space regulations, which exist for very good and sane reasons to stop overcrowding in like an unethical way. But when people are deliberately wanting to live in a space that would qualify as being too small because of overcrowding, is there some way that we can update those regulations to differentiate between bad overcrowding and deliberate overcrowding in terms of a tiny house space?
Perfect, thank you. And I'll just put in a shameless plug there, that if you're interested in this notion of housing, we do have on our YouTube playlist a really great panel discussion from a couple of months ago, which includes a presentation from Colin McFarlane from Durham, and he does discuss the ideas of crowding. So just a side plug there. We have another question. I study geography at Penn State, and I'm interested in intentional communities from a feminist perspective. Something I'm seeing is how women are less burdened with house labour in communal living. I'm wondering if you're hearing the same from your participants, if being in tiny homes helps women specifically, who are often the ones disproportionately burdened with house labour.
This is a glorious question. Hello, colleague from Penn State, wherever you are. So this is something that I am going forward focusing on as more of a central tenet of my thesis. So my 2 great loves in life are making stuff and women. And initially, when I began my PhD, it was focused more on the making stuff component of it. But as I'm progressing with the research, the relevance of this type of technology to women, specifically as a marginalized group, is becoming more and more salient. I won't speculate and give you any answers now when I haven't done the research yet. I wonder if you're going to live in a tiny house in a heterosexual pairing, you have to have quite a lot of conversations, right? About, do we want to live in this weird way where everyone's going to go, what, a tiny house, you live in a shed, what's going on? Which might suggest that there is already a decent level of conversation and shared decision making, which could also suggest that that translates into other areas of their life. I hope that's the case. But I am also aware of how pernicious and insidious gender norms are, and how easily they can be perpetuated without us even realizing it. So I love this question. Maybe we can talk about it together at a later date, and maybe this time next year I'll have a real answer for you.
Classic 2020, I was muted. Okay, related to the question I asked earlier about demographics, someone asks if you could talk about the characteristics of your interview partners, obviously without breaching ethical things, but just kind of in general terms where those kind of characteristics fall.
What a fun question. What are the general characteristics of my participants? There is a certain flavor of unafraidness about them, because in any sort of countercultural group, anyone who's doing something that really goes against the grain, you can expect to find a fairly decent, solid kernel of, well, I think what you're doing is silly or suboptimal, so I'm going to go and try and do something else despite all of the many barriers. So that's something that I really respect and enjoy about them. But maybe what I enjoy most is how different they all are from each other, you know? There's like some old granddad retired who just wants to grow his own carrots and get left alone. He doesn't really like anyone. And then there's young couples who want to live close to their parents because the parents have become disabled and they want to live near them in a neighborhood that they can't afford to live in so that they can fulfill those duties. People of color, people with money, people without money, people with degrees and PhDs, people who left school with O levels and nothing else. Like, really, I would say it's the variety that's the most consistent factor in the demographics. Yeah.
I'm falling into my trap time and time again. Okay, fantastic talk, Alice. Thank you. And thank you for all your work in this area. A big stumbling block I have noticed when conducting my own personal research is planning permission. This is something I think you've talked about before, but is the backyard/private land route the only way, apart from the designated communal sites you mentioned? I found Wales are a little more forward thinking, but with certain restrictions, a small holding, business, etc. But generally land is the issue in the UK.
Yep, I completely agree. It's spot on, essentially. So the Wales is a great example. They have some very sensible legislature in place called the One Planet Directive, which means essentially that you have default planning permission to build more or less what you want if you can meet certain criteria about how it's going to generate its own energy for X amount of years in the future, and how the materials that you're using to build it have low carbon burden, like they're timbers that grow in Wales that don't need to be transported really far. Just, very sensible stuff like that to incentivize people to build in this way, which is more closely aligned to a tiny house permaculture approach to construction and living. We don't have anything like that in England. Access to land here is abysmal. I think that Scotland is doing a better job, significantly better job than England. I know that you have is it an organization? There's a big movement anyway to like redistribute access to land. And you have a strong culture in Scotland of the hutting practice. And so ideas about tiny houses and common land are still more in the forefront of the cultural imagination than they are in England. Aside from building it in your backyard or having rich mates, I think that community action is the way to do it. I think community land trusts, community interest corporations, where you build together, you can live in communal housing or separately, but just on land that you all manage together. That seems to me to be realistic and good and fair.
Brilliant. And related to the just checking I wasn't muted again, related to the Scottish aspect, somebody has added into the chat that folks might find thousandhuts.org,
exactly,
which is a Scottish initiative, interesting. So that's just a suggestion for further reading.
Yeah.
Does then building tiny houses imply that we have to live in the countryside and outskirts, or is it possible to build them in the town despite the land tax, which would be higher?
Yeah, that's a great question. because of course conversations about rural versus urban are intimately connected to ideas about class and wealth and all those kinds of things. I would say that in my own research, there's a fairly equidistant distribution of tiny houses that are in rural, peri-urban, and like tightly in the middle of metropolitan areas. I'm particularly interested in tiny houses used in urban areas, as I mentioned briefly in the talk, as a way to dilute the effects of urban sprawl and to develop small plots of land within the city that wouldn't be developable otherwise. So like pockets of land that major developers wouldn't touch. They couldn't make enough money from it. It would be too much of a pain. They can't get their heavy plant machinery in there, that kind of thing. Tiny houses circumnavigate a lot of those issues because of how quick and easy and light on infrastructure they are to build. With our work with Uphouse, we're looking at deliberately making sure that these self-built tiny house plots are in the city. We want people to be able to commute to the commercial districts in York by foot or bike or public transport. We're really trying to present them as one grain in like the multi-pronged approach to how much more populated urban spaces are now than they were built to be, and how that trend is only going to increase for the future.
Brilliant. We've got a lot of questions coming through, so we may have to start chunking some of them together. So we have a question about, related to that, so we have somebody here who says, I'm in the States, specifically Connecticut. There are no tiny home communities, let alone plethoras of tiny homes. What would you say is the first step for me as a single mother trying to build a tiny home? Would that be to build it in a desert area where building codes are limiting?
Hello. First of all, hello. It's very exciting that you're joining us from the US. Where should you start as a single mum in Connecticut? Well, when I'm in a situation where I'm not sure what to do or where to go, my first instinct is always to try and make some friends and get a community around me, because it's generally been my experience that two heads are better than one, and that effect is amplified. Do you have any way of joining tiny house communities through social media, where you can access advice that's more tailored to your specific location? So I wouldn't be able to tell you anything useful at all about building regulations and zoning laws based on where you are, but certainly there will be people with that insight and expertise who I suspect it should be fairly easy for you to encounter online. I know that there's a really vibrant tiny house community existing online, very niche ones about people who only want to build tiny tree houses and everything that you can imagine. You can get a lot of advice tailored specifically to your needs. So that's where I would suggest you start first.
Brilliant. Okay, we've got a couple of questions related to almost like a culture change. So we have, somebody says, do you think there is a larger culture change occurring from dreaming about that big house on the hill and an appetite to buy as big as you can, to a culture that's now recognizing the quality or need for small and sustainable, not just in financial management, but as a whole lifestyle? And then related to that, we have, is there more of an emphasis on altruism and reflecting on ecological footprints within the tiny house movement? Or is it more of a utilitarian exercise of minimizing living costs? Or is it a mix of egotistic and altruistic motivations?
What delicious questions. What a glorious audience. Thank you for these. Okay, so item number one, rebelling against the Mcmansion trend. Yes, very much so. So lots of the participants that I've spoken to, and this is also reflected in the existing literature, is that people recognize that the Mcmansion era and sort of the cultural offerings that go alongside with that, you know, like the power suit, the Bluetooth headset, the kitten heels, is not doing anything good for people. And that's part of what's informing their decision to look for something else, and not just something else, but something diametrically opposed to that as a form of cultural resistance. So yes, completely, that's a great observation. The case in the UK is quite interesting because whilst in America, Canada, Australia, house sizes have been growing steadily since the 1970s. They're now like 1,200 square feet per person or something wild, in tandem with family sizes shrinking. Houses are bigger in Australia and the US now than ever before. In the UK, our average house sizes have been shrinking since the 70s, not to the same extent that houses overseas have been growing, but still the context in that area is very different. We don't really have the Mcmansions to rebel against. But what we do share, all of those nations, is both a chronic and acute affordable housing shortage and stagnating wages. So what it seems to be the case that people are becoming disillusioned with the promises of neoliberalism. They're recognizing that someone's benefiting from this situation, but it's not them. So they're looking for ways to be less complicit in that. And as far as this fantastic question regarding altruism versus utilitarianism, I will say both, on the grounds that people are rarely one thing or another, and most often a fluxing conglomeration of those two things plus 500 others, depending on what situation they're in, how much they've had to eat that day, how well they've slept, etc. There is definitely a lot of both going on. Perhaps my sampling is maybe a little bit skewed or something, but I would say if I had to put it a little bit more on one side, it would be a utilitarian one. People are struggling to survive. They can't pay their bills. They're terrified about what the rest of their lives are going to be like. And so in that sense, it's utilitarian, but they are looking to meet those utilitarian aims in a way that respects values like permaculture, sustainability, reducing carbon footprint.
Brilliant. Okay, we're going to chunk a few more together. Most of the tiny house participants you quote from are self-builders, yet the tiny house movement I'm more familiar with from the US, home help service agencies such as Opportunity Village in Eugene, Oregon, is more about rebuilding dignity and, quote, more than housing via collective enterprise solutions to homelessness. Do you see a tension between retreat tiny house individualism and a tiny house movement based more on building alternative communities? And linked to that, are all your tiny house dwellers individual homesteaders, or are there also collectives where tiny houses build a village?
So this question about self-builders and sort of the individual imperative to build versus a collective imperative to build. I do know about Opportunity Village, and there's Dignity Village, and there's quite a lot of, there's a stronger movement in the US of collective tiny houses. In the UK, we're really only just catching up with that. Now, Bristol Tiny Houses, Bristol Tiny Home Community is the only example that I know of in the UK that's actually moving ahead with building tiny homes in England. So in Scotland, you have Social Bite and Findhorn, even right up at the north. I think there is, you're right, there's a really interesting tension between sort of this northern Anglophone conception of what makes the good life. It's a self-contained dwelling with a garden front and back, ideally a fence, you know, that kind of thing, which is simultaneously refuted and reinforced by tiny houses. So they're essentially still replicating that housing type, right? It's a self-contained dwelling, ideally in someone's garden or in the countryside or whatever, at least with a garden, you know, that whole sort of aesthetic. But at the same time, it is arguing with the way in which we have been taught that buying and owning your own home, real home, is the number one form of symbolic consumption that you can ever do that shows that you have made it in life and you're a successful person because you own your house. Whilst at the same time reinforcing the lionizing of home ownership as this like apical achievement in a person's life. So I have definitely not answered your question, but it is certainly an interesting line of conversation and one that kind of underpins my whole thesis. And one, just to say as well, anyone who has other questions or would like this conversation to continue, I'm extremely keen to hear from all of you. So please do feel free. Alice, will my email address and my contact details and stuff be available somewhere that the audience can find to continue?
Absolutely, I can. When we've got the YouTube recording ready to go live, I'll make sure that I pop your email address in there as well. And I'll send that out through the Eventbrite platform. So everyone who registered gets a chance to see that and continue the conversation.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it really is a sincere invitation as well. I'm very keen to talk. Sorry, Alice, remind me what the second portion of the questions before were.
Oh, that is a very, very good question. Are all your tiny house dwellers individual homesteaders, or are there also collective tiny houses that come together in a village?
Yeah, okay, so I think I sort of touched on this a little bit in that Bristol Tiny House Community is the only collective group that I know of. At Op House, we're going to try and make it collective, but most of them are individuals, yeah.
Okay, and we've got two that sort of orient more towards critiques potentially. There's the obvious critique that this is an individualized, privatized solution to multiple crises. How does tiny housing and other similar innovations relate to communing and more, quote, socialized responses to housing injustice? And a different angle, but it's still kind of a critique angle. What would be a way to make sure that a growing tiny house movement does not lead to urban sprawl?
Sorry, I'm just writing these down so I can answer the right.
That's a good idea.
Okay, so how do individualized, privatized tiny house projects relate to a communal response to housing justice? It's a great question. I think it links really to what we were discussing before, in that in many ways, tiny houses can be seen to replicate the housing system that we already have, just on a cheaper scale, right? So in many ways, it's a fair critique that tiny houses aren't really doing anything different. They're just really cheap. And maybe that's just another way of the neoliberal machine to consume anything with potentially radical implications and repackage it as a product of capitalism, you know, like, look at this nice thing, it's cute and cheap, do you want one? I think that's a really valid critique. Where it could become emancipatory would be in ensuring that the people who stand to benefit the most from this are the people who can access it, which isn't the case at the moment. It's people who already have the money, as we've discussed. People who already have the money, people who can save the money, people who already have the land, people who can access the land. And that's the way that privilege functions, you know, it insulates people from discomfort and it stops them from having to struggle to achieve whatever the thing is that they're trying to achieve. And so my hope and suspicion is that, as, for example, Tiny House Community Bristol, as a flagship example of this in England, takes off and we can see it being successful and more people will get to know about it and more communities will organize around this. I suspect that it will work best as a grassroots community-led development that will allow each tiny house community to be bespoke, not only in terms of the individual dwellings, but also bespoke to the community, bespoke to the geopolitical situation in which they're located. And how to make sure that tiny houses don't contribute to urban sprawl is, again, a fantastic question, which I guess we've sort of skirted around a little bit in the talk. It's such a sad irony, isn't it, that so often the people who escape the city to enjoy the countryside are the ones who end up destroying more than anyone else the very thing that they've gone to try and enjoy, right? Because they escape to the countryside in their 4x4 and then still commute back into town every day for their job. So it's a really valid observation. Off the top of my head, I guess my response to that would be that using tiny houses strategically as urban infill, like we spoke about before, on pockets of urban land that nobody else will develop or that isn't valuable enough, or where you could perhaps only build one tiny house and there's no way a developer is going to come along and build like one skinny little terraced house on that plot. I think that could be a great way to make the most of concentrating development in urban spaces and not contributing to sprawl.
Great. We have a longish one here. It It's a very interesting topic for me, who works on gated communities addressing middle and upper middle classes related to consumption and global capitalism. Tiny houses address a different group of people getting away from this system. So the first questions I think about are around security, permission or tax, pets, how do they live in such small spaces? The tiny house seems a suburban or a rural thing. Are there any in urban areas? We've talked about that. The tiny house seems a very individualistic solution to certain problems like housing, and it's different from other housing forms such as co-housing. In Turkey, there are geçikondos, I apologize if that's mispronounced, which are shelters built in a short period of time in urban edges. They were built for necessity and lack of public housing for the working classes.
Yeah, the examples from Turkey, it's great to bring that up because I certainly don't want to be guilty of suggesting that tiny houses are a new invention or something that white people have come up with. That's not the case at all. Tiny houses have existed in cultures for as far back as there is recorded history. So every culture has examples of things that are akin to tiny houses. So Burkina Faso round houses, tiny like bamboo constructions in Japan. Everywhere you look, there are examples of this. So in that way, tiny houses aren't novel as a construction, rather their deliberate use and their spread, and they're being advocated for as a legitimate housing alternative is perhaps something that we're seeing since the financial crash, really since the global economic downturn, which has seen many people unable to recover from the devastation that's caused. The other question, how do pets live in them? Depends on your pet. If you have a Great Dane, probably with great difficulty. But plenty of my participants have pets, cats and, fish, some sea monkeys. They seem to, pets are members of the family, right? So people factor this in when they're deciding about where they're going to live and how they're going to live. Like I care more about if my cats are comfortable than really anyone else. The question about gated communities, middle-class people, looking to sequester themselves away, but tiny house people are trying to get away from capitalism. Have I spoken to that question? Did I accidentally ignore that?
I think it is. I think we've kind of touched on that as we've gone through the kind of ideology behind tiny houses versus non-tiny houses. Yeah. So perhaps I think the pets one is an important one to think about. And we've kind of touched on some of the other questions around the kind of permissions and the taxes required. So the last couple of really small things. We have an amazing thank you. We have, do you live in a tiny house yourself?
I do not live in a tiny house myself because that would be illegal. And I'll leave it there. Okay.
Amazing, thank you. This is a very efficient presentation. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you, that was brilliant. Fantastic presentation, great exploration around the topic. Still inspired to not contribute to ecocide, resources permitting. Thank you, not a question, just a big thank you.
Lovely, thank you.
Now we have a question again, sorry. I'm studying civil engineering at the University of Surrey, looking to focus on whether tiny homes are an affordable housing option for homelessness. Is there any particular area of research from an engineering perspective that you think could be highlighted or focused on?
As somebody who is not an engineer, I would be loath to lead you astray or to pretend that I know anything at all about engineering. Perhaps this would be cool for us to talk about the two of us, and maybe I could introduce you to some papers or some people who might know more about that kind of arena, but it's so far outside of my area of knowledge. I wouldn't want to lead you astray.
It's exciting to see that it's becoming something that so many people are interested in. So, okay, right, interesting. And this is something I jotted down as well. I'm in geography at the University of Exeter in the field of renewable energy. I'm interested to know if any of your participants were off-grid.
Yes, lots of them were off-grid. Most of them were off-grid. Most people had solar panels, backup generators, which tended to be fuel powered, but that they would only be used, you know, in emergencies so they don't get stuck anywhere. A few people with little wind turbines, grey water harvesting, things like that. If I had to try and put a figure on it, I'd say 90% of them are off grid. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. Can the tiny house community in the Netherlands be visited?
Yes, absolutely. And they're mint as well. They're such great people. Google Minitopia, but Google Minitopia Den Bosch, otherwise it will give you a car dealership. And then get in touch with them and organize yourself a visit. It's a fantastic place to go. They're sensational people. I recommend you go for a visit.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. There is roughly 1 acre of land per person in the UK. It could be both redistributed and collectively protected. Great talk and discussion. Thank you to all the Alices. Thank you very much for your answer. Thanks for the interesting talk. It was great we were given the chance to follow you through your arguments from the opening with an overview of problems in an intriguing way to the case of women-built tiny houses is one possible answer to mitigate many aspects of these. I also really enjoyed the adjunct discussion. Brilliant, thank you. From Santa Fe, New Mexico, I'm interested in a smaller footprint. Thanks for ideas. This has expanded so much my knowledge of the tiny house movement. I think I will plan a visit to Bristol and the Minitopia. Hopefully not the car dealership though. I also didn't know about the mushroom bricks. Thank you so much. Heart emoji. We've got one last quick question. Perhaps we'll make this the last one actually. Just a day-to-day question. Do people in tiny houses off-grid have difficulty receiving post, registering with a GP, etc.?
This is a great question. Really relevant for lots of my participants, especially because many of the tiny house on wheels model requires you to move around. So it's legal for you to be there in a parking space, say in a city, as long as you're not there for too long. So in that case, what people need is a social network where they can designate their mate's house as their postal residence or as their like permanent residence, which isn't ideal, of course, because this will have like different tax and legal implications. It's very much a workaround, which so much of the tiny house movement is about, right? They're all workarounds. The situation that we have isn't ideal. What can we do to sort of get by? And the postal issue is one of them. But there are some people who, so for example, have some participants who've built a trailer-based model, but they're keeping it in a field and they're going to keep it there for the foreseeable future. And they have just started putting the tiny house in the field, such and such a road, blah, blah, and have put a little, you know, like an American style letterbox at the gate of the field. And for a while, they didn't get any post for ages. And then eventually the post person clocked on and they sort of just trained the postal service to bring their post to the field. So again, a workaround, probably a little dubious as to if you're actually going to get your correspondence, but has been proven successful in some situations.
Brilliant. Okay. So yeah, I think we can probably leave it there. I feel like we've bombarded you with questions for the last 40 minutes. So we'll just finish with a really nice comment of thanks for a great talk. If anyone would like to connect with me in my tiny house journey, one of the participants has popped a link to her Instagram tiny house journey in the chat. So hopefully, and it was to everybody, so hopefully everyone can see that. So from my end, I'd just like to say thank you to Alice for coming along and talking to us today. Really appreciated. And yeah, it was a great talk and a really enjoyable discussion. Yeah, thank you for the thank yous coming in. It was a really lively discussion. I enjoyed it a great deal. I think before I say goodbye, just to make you aware that we have another talk coming up next month. We tend to have talks at least once, maybe twice a month, usually on incredibly disparate topics. So next month we have a talk from Ted Gutch from Lancaster University, all about fake news, which seems an interesting way to finish up 2020. And going into the new year, we'll be thinking about all manner of things, from social media in China to climate gentrification. So keep an eye, if you're interested, on the Eventbrite listing page for our account, and you can keep track of all of the events that we've got coming up. But other than that, thank you again for everyone coming along and for spending some of your Tuesday evening with us. And thank you again to Alice for giving such an exciting presentation tonight.
I've had such a good time. Thank you so much to everyone for your enthusiasm and your participation. It's been really, really good fun for me. And thank you again, Alice, for making this happen for all of us. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks a lot.
Cool. Bye, everyone.
Bye.